Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning and good evening to those of you that are in different time zones. My name's Liz Weaver, and I'm the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar, The Changing Role of Philanthropy. I'm excited to guide today's discussion on philanthropy with our guests, Louise Pulford and Sophie Monaghan-Coombs from Social Innovation Exchange. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes introducing them first, and then we'll learn more about the Social Innovation Exchange. So first we'll introduce Louise. Louise Pulford is the Chief Executive Officer of SIX, a social innovation exchange that was built on mutual value, relationships, and knowledge. SIX works globally to facilitate purposeful cross-sector conversations that challenge and inspire people to advance the field of social innovation. Louise has been responsible for building SIX over the last 6 years. Over 6 years, that's kind of cool. Under her leadership, SIX was spun out of the Young Foundation in 2013. Louise leads a team of 9 individuals spread across London and Canada to advance the field of social innovation through major programs of work with foundations, universities, corporates, and government. Louise is also building SIX's work to advance a culture of change within organizations. Sophie Monaghan-Coombs is the Strategy and Development Manager at SIX. Sophie leads the program of work with philanthropy, the SIX Funders Node. And I actually had the opportunity to meet both Sophie and Louise at a session in Wasson Island. And it was through that node, through Sophie's node, that we gathered together. And you'll hear a little bit more about that today. The program works with philanthropic foundations all over the world, challenging them, and inspiring them to be more transformational and increase their impact. Sophie manages the group of organizations that makes up SIX's core partners, the SIX Global Council. Sophie joined SIX in February of 2018 after working for charities based in London and the Big Issue magazine at their editorial headquarters in Glasgow. She graduated in 2017 with a degree in English literature, where she specialized in contemporary literature, dealing with issues such as gender and the environment. So both Louise and Sophie bring a lot of skills and knowledge and a global perspective to this work and to the topic that we have today. So I'd like to welcome you both to the webinar, Louise and Sophie.
Thank you for having us.
So I want to start off with our first question. And the first question is, would you be able to tell us a little bit more? I've kind of given the folks in the audience a little bit of background about the Social Innovation Exchange, but tell us a little bit more about the organization, what it's been up to these last 6 years, and maybe your specific roles within the organization. Why don't we start off with you, Louise?
Sure. Thank you, Liz, and thank you for inviting us to be part of this conversation today. We had a great call with you a couple of weeks ago, and so I'm sure we're going to have a really fruitful conversation today. Thank you. So SIX is a funny organisation, actually. We really do what it says on the tin, that we are a social innovation exchange, and we're really focused on exchange. And actually, we've been around for about a decade, but we grew out of an organisation called the Young Foundation, that many of you may know, based here in London. And the Young Foundation at that time was being led by Jeff Morgan, again, who many of you will know, who kind of coined the term social innovation, or at least wrote a lot about it in those days. And SIX was established as a kind of a network that was quite different to the networks that existed at the time. So at the time, it was very much thought that social change was really led by individual entrepreneurs and not collectives. And many of the networks that were around social change at that time really focused on specific areas like health or education. And for us, social innovation is something broader than that. It's something that connects across those networks. So SIX was set up with the view that that change comes from lots of different people across sectors, and so we still work across those sectors. We're most well known as a connector and a convener, as that exchange function, but we also do the capacity building programs. We do a lot of knowledge and insights sharing and curation as well. We work across 6 strategic areas in all of our work. So those are business, in particular working on a project at the moment on how we can motivate businesses to do more good, sponsored by the government in Hong Kong, and with a team of consultants and others in Hong Kong there too. So business is one of those. Policy, we're well known for all the work we've done with the European Commission, influencing the Commission to include social innovation in their policy and talking to them about how to finance and measure it, etc. Another of our strategic areas is working with universities, particularly interesting at the moment as the changing role of universities that we see. We focus a lot on next generation leaders. That's another area of our work. Really, how do we bring social innovation values, skills, capabilities and mindsets into young people these days? We also do a lot of work movement building, and this is something that's particularly interested perhaps to some of your Canadian followers and listeners, because we're working with the McConnell Foundation and the Saputo Foundation at the moment to bring our global Wayfinder event to Canada, but actually making it more global and being an online event at the moment. But we are working very closely with Canadian partners on that, and we can talk about that later. But also we have a lot of work with foundations and funders, as Sophie can tell you more about.
Yeah, so the Funders Node is our programme with Philanthropy, which is specifically focused on philanthropic organisations, but our kind of cross-sector outlook and our other programmes of work really influence it as well. So it started off about 5 years ago by bringing together small groups of funders and asking them to invite a funder friend. And it gradually kind of grew from that. So the question that we always asked was, what's keeping you awake at night? We wanted to focus on the big questions, the things that you might not necessarily have time to kind of work on during the day-to-day. So it's grown from that, and we do convening. So as Liz was saying, we met at one of our retreats. We do other kind of smaller events, but we've also started kind of building knowledge and learning within the field. So producing reports and things like that, and capacity building. So running training for foundations on topics like systems change. We work with foundations of lots of different sizes, lots of different types, and from all over the world. And this year we'll talk a little bit more about it, I'm sure later, but this year we're focusing on power and really trying to interrogate power dynamics within philanthropy and also their partners and their communities.
So it's really interesting, and I think this is why I wanted to invite both of you onto the call, was to really explore the function that SIX undertakes, which is convening folks in the sector, convening philanthropy, convening business, convening universities. And so what are some of the themes that emerged last year? I was interested in reading your report about this, but what are some of the themes that emerged from the convenings last year?
So I can give a kind of introduction to the retreats that we hosted last year. We held 3 in Canada. And they were all quite different. So the first one was on philanthropy and the private sector. We brought together kind of representatives from the private sector, from philanthropy, both from corporate foundations and others, as well as intermediaries. And we had a conversation, which we really tried to ground in the fact that these resources come from the same place, but as sectors they're often viewed very differently. So we talked a lot about how you build trust across sectors, why there's kind of a need to find more common language, especially around things like public value, having more spaces to collaborate, and more opportunities to learn from each sector. Our second retreat was on risk and legitimacy, which is a particularly kind of interesting topic because of our current situation. And we were really thinking about risk, real risks versus perceived risk to foundations. And, you know, thinking about how in lots of ways, foundations, one of their main risks is reputational. And also thinking about how we can kind of transform risk to have it as something that's thought about more positively in the same way that you would with your investments. And then our third retreat was on social cohesion and the role for philanthropy. So really thinking about colonial legacies and power, and a lot of our kind of work this year focusing on power came out of that retreat.
I think, as Sophie was saying, those were what the focus of the retreats were on, but actually, you know, there was also some themes that cut across all of those retreats as well. And as Sophie said, you know, they're quite different in nature if you think about, you know, one on social cohesion and one on the role of the private sector. But actually, there was a couple of themes that really cut across there. And so one of those very clearly came out, and is coming out in all of our work actually with foundations and philanthropy, is the changing role of foundation and the changing role of philanthropy, and the different roles that foundations can and are playing that is beyond just giving grants and the transfer of money. Lots of that focuses on philanthropy as a kind of as a collaborator, seeing philanthropy and foundations as part of a system rather than the system within themselves. So there's a lot of philanthropy looking outwards, philanthropy as an advocate, as an activist, also as a convener. We're seeing lots and lots of philanthropic foundations seeing their convening power of also bringing sectors together. You know, I think there is something for Six about being a neutral convener, but there's also something about the power of philanthropy to bring other sectors together that I think is interesting. And then how they're working across sectors, so seeing themselves as responsible for, you know, supporting or interweaving with government. And I think this is interesting right now, but also, you know, the rise of corporate philanthropy and bringing that in-house. So that's something around the changing role that was interesting. And there's also a load of stuff that came out around boards and the role of governance in foundations in particular. That was a strong topic that came up that needed to be unpicked a little bit more. And then, as Sophie was saying, you know, power, and in particular around power, things that seemed important last year that I think develop now were the methods and models used to shift power. Lots of people in those three retreats saw philanthropy as having a lot of power. Philanthropy, I think, sometimes thinks it doesn't have a lot of power. So that's an interesting conversation. Democracy and the role of philanthropy in politics as well, which links to the changing role and the nature of collaboration as well. But also technology, like tech was a key theme that came out across those retreats too.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I reflect on the convening that I attended, which was the one on social cohesion. And, you know, a lot of the themes that both of you reflected on were threads of conversation within that convening, right? That the folks that attended that convening not only looked at the role of philanthropy, but then they looked at things like climate and disruptive times and power and the power relationship and really engaging authentic voice and that kind of thing. And so it's interesting how, you know, I would imagine that over the number of convenings that Six hosts and gathers people together, that the themes, you can see patterns of themes emerging over and over again. My next question really is a little bit about that. So have these themes changed the way that you see philanthropic organizations and business leaders and others that you've convened? Have you seen the themes that were discussed at these convenings actually changed the way that they're doing their work, or inform the way that they're doing their work?
I think definitely. I think definitely inform, and I think, you know, power is and I hope sometimes change as well. Power is clearly one of the key components that changes the way that or informs the way that institutions see themselves. And, you know, philanthropy, having conversations about power, also makes them think, what is our own power? And, you know, the idea of acknowledging inequalities in our work and in the way that we do our work, I think is important. So, you know, I think some of the retreats and the conversations, particularly the business leaders and businesses and philanthropy attend, are in themselves quite exclusive. The kind of conversations are very focused on holding power, really, and keeping that separate. And so, you know, how do we make sure that these kind of forums are less exclusive in the way that they're organized? I think also the role of boards is a really interesting one. Quite a lot of boards, you know, still hold a lot of decision making power, or certainly power over organizations, and so we have seen, and I think you will see in Canada, I'm sure there's lots of examples of people on your call as well who are doing this, but lots of people are rethinking the makeup of their board. So making sure that it's not just about kind of established elite white rich men being on boards, but actually that the people who are sitting on the boards are reflecting the organizations that the foundation is trying to serve. So we're seeing lots and lots of calls for boards to become more diverse, to include young people on, but also lots of tools and processes within foundations, like participatory grant making. You know, it's very, very fashionable to think about that is about shifting power yourself as a foundation. So there's lots of processes and tools that are doing that. And then maybe just alongside that, the work that we'll be doing around business for good, I think is example of where we're seeing this pattern play out in non-philanthropy as well. And actually where businesses are, we're looking at what motivates businesses to change and to think about their value and impact on society and people and their stakeholders, as well as their shareholders as well. And so businesses are also opening up some of these kinds of processes, and we've been doing some case studies, and I think Suncor and Maple Leaf are two examples of corporates that we've looked at in our global study that you will all know in Canada, who I think are starting to do this really, really well as well.
So before we go to the next question, I just want to follow up with a quick question to you, Louise. So how does, and maybe even to Sophie as well, how does SIX in its approach to convening, how do you make sure that different voices and different perspectives are represented? Because you mentioned that just briefly, but you didn't go into it, Louise. So I'm interested in kind of understanding the process that you undertake, because I know that the session on social cohesion, it was quite a diverse group of perspectives that you gathered for that, and still, you know, make sure that there's good conversation that happens.
Absolutely, thanks for that, Liz. Yeah, so I mean, one of our kind of core drivers and our kind of core value proposition at SIX is to bring together really different perspectives. So any kind of convening where people are coming together and, you know, just saying the same thing, you know, if you're coming and the person next to you has the same opinion as you, then it's probably not the most useful use of your time to come and just be repeating. And that said, it's always a balance for us. So, for example, you know, the retreats on Watson Island, they are exclusive. They're for people that, can afford to fly there. There's only space for a certain number of people, for example. So and we've been urged to really be thinking about this, because we, again, can't talk about power and then not think about power dynamics ourselves. So as you said, one way is making sure that we get diversity of voices in every group that that we have, even if it's big and small. And we have to balance sometimes doing big and small, because, you know, we're not an organization that focuses on mass convenings of hundreds and hundreds of people. We are about small, focused, purposeful, impactful exchange. That's our core business. So there will be small gatherings, but we've been pushed a lot in this current situation that we're all in at the moment to accelerate the way that we're thinking about engaging more people. So accelerate the way that we're having these kind of conversations online, making sure that the conversations that we do have at the Social Cohesion Retreat are communicated really effectively and shared as widely as possible. There is a particular foundation in the UK who has come to our retreat and says they want their staff to feel to have the same kind of exposure that she had there. So we do training with that particular organisation and then provide lots and lots of links to other organisations globally to make sure that those people, you know, the staff of the organisation get the same benefit as the CEO did who came to those kind of organisations. So I think through communication tools, through making sure that we're open with our insights and sharing, and making sure that we spread the message down the organisations, and then making sure that we're purposeful around who we invite, why, and how we have that conversation is some of the things that we're doing. And increasingly we're doing, you know, as you said, more online. So when I'm going to meetings now, I quite often just invite someone from the team to come along and say, well, why don't you, you know, it's not about flying somewhere, or it's not about traveling somewhere. You can literally just sign in online. So why don't you just come to the meeting with me and listen to what we're talking about? So this is a really nice opportunity for us to play with that power again.
Yeah, I know that for the social cohesion session, I remember a pre-call with Sophie prior to that session where, you know, materials were shared and we talked about my perspectives, and then there was a post follow-up call. So there is also this kind of more than just having the conversation. It seems to me that there's also a relationship that Six is generating with the folks that they're engaging in this kind of shared work, and in this this way of thinking about how do we shift systems with purpose and intentionality.
Yeah, thanks for that, Liz. Absolutely. And this is why we're here having another version of the same conversation as well, that, you know, these should be, you know, when we're organizing these things, is about building relationships that last. So we're very intentional about who we build those relationships with in the first place. And as Sophie said, when we started the funders node, it was very much ask a friend who would who was also thinking like this and come along. And I think, you know, friends to friends to friends, snowballing in that way and growing a community through relationships, I think is really, really important.
So my next question is really focusing on this kind of time of disruption that we're all going through, or maybe it's even a time of dynamic change. And so we're seeing it certainly in the work of Tamarack and in our work with communities. But how do you think this disruption will play out for philanthropy, for universities, for business, for some of the key people that you've engaged in and the key sectors that you've engaged with at Six?
So I can start off with the kind of philanthropy response, but I think kind of across the board it shows that sectors can be really, really quick to adapt when forced to. And, you know, if it's from kind of working from home, really, really quickly, everyone is, you know, many people have been able to do that. But also kind of, yeah, in terms of philanthropy, how you make grants and your processes and things like that. And I think one question which Six are really interested in, and we know that there's a lot of talk about now is how we channel that sort of responsive attitude towards the climate crisis once we come out the other side of this crisis. So in terms of philanthropy, one example in the UK, there's been a funder statement from the London funders, and I know that there's been a similar initiative in the US and elsewhere, with kind of commitments to really flexible funding that's unrestricted, that's really quick for grantees. And one question that we have going forward is, does that become the norm? And, why isn't it already? And although this is, a really, really particular crisis and a particular time that we're in, I think lots of charities feel squeezed throughout the year and would appreciate this, that kind of flexibility anyway. Another couple of things that, we're thinking about in terms of philanthropy, one is the relationship with government. So when is philanthropy plugging gaps, which should be actually led by the state, and rather than funding the innovative and the new and exploring kind of future possibilities of solutions. And then lastly, the kind of thing that we're sort of thinking about in particular is ensuring that in this kind of emergency response, lots of funders are kind of stopping funding any new partners and really focusing on their grantees at the moment and making sure that they have support, which of course is incredibly important. But at the same time, there are lots of marginalized groups that aren't represented well enough in those kind of small grantees. Small grassroots organizations. And so how do, philanthropic organizations ensure that by doing that, you're not kind of perpetuating a lack of diversity, which might already exist in your portfolio?
Louise, anything you want to add in here?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've been amused by with ourselves is strategic foresight. So a few years ago, in 2018, and we hosted a retreat on with a group of foundations on Boston Island, looking at the topic of philanthropy and strategic foresight. And specifically, we were looking at, strategic foresight is a very well-known method and process that is used a lot, of course, within business, and drives a lot of Shell's work and others, and they have very, very rigorous processes to how to do it. And for the way we wanted to apply it, philanthropy, or the kind of conversations we had, it is how can philanthropy use the same kind of methods and models to look ahead, to future-proof themselves, almost, to look at different scenarios, to identify weak signals, all those same kind of processes. And it's interesting in relation to this question, because it's about seeing the changes ahead of time, or kind of, preparing for these changes before they happen, or preparing for some kind of disruption. And I remember so distinctly, being in Canada with this group of global foundations, and everyone saying, well, what kind of burning platform could we fabricate to make us have this conversation in a different kind of conversation? What could possibly be so bad globally that might make us think differently about the kind of role that we play? And not one person in the group, including us, thought of a global pandemic like COVID-19. So it's an interesting, it's just interesting reflecting on that conversation now, to think about how can we prepare for different kinds of change. And actually that group has come back together, so they're reconvening this Friday, in fact, to look at what role, if any, does strategic foresight play in the global pandemic. What should foundations play in terms of the third horizon, thinking about longer term recovery. So are we acting now, or are we thinking about our role now in terms of an emergency response, or our role as a stabilizer, or our role as a kind of future imagination, and where we should be heading, which is a lot of the work of Julia Unwin, who works with us a little bit in the UK, is thinking about these different time horizons. We're having a conversation about how together we should respond to COVID-19 as a group of people who were together in 2018. So in terms of the kind of changes we're seeing, it doesn't really answer that question, but it poses a question: how can we be prepared for the kind of changes, and what does it mean for us being more prepared about things in future? So where are we supposed to be, where can we be playing in this? And actually, if anyone's interested in being part of that conversation, please, do get in touch with us.
It is really interesting, just picking up on that. I've been reflecting and in the midst of writing a paper this week about collective impact and collective impact efforts, and how they are responding, or how could they be a framework or an approach that could, navigate this. And one of the things that I have been thinking about and in reflecting on the paper is that there's almost this kind of multi-level approach, right? Our response in some ways is both very personal, but also there are ripple effects in our organizations, and then, in our communities. And, I was also thinking this morning about how reflecting on a paper that Tim Broadhead, who used to be the CEO of the McConnell Family Foundation, he wrote a paper in 2008 in response to the financial crisis and the paper was titled "Not Letting a Crisis Go to Waste." And he just has written a new paper on not letting another crisis go to waste. But in that paper, he talks about, some trends that he's seen, and how we should be observant of these trends and really think about how we don't go back to the old pattern, but that we lean into these trends and figure out kind of a new normal, right? And so reflecting on that, I've just been thinking about, okay, so, what makes the global pandemic different from, let's say, the 2008 financial crisis? And I think the fact that it's global creates a different level of conversation, right? And so how do we really embrace this different level of conversation? The fact that it's happening in the UK and Australia, across Europe, across Canada, the United States, and to what degree is the shared experience deeper? And what could we do that leverages this shared experience? It's just some of the things that have been swirling around my head as I've been reflecting, because I do think it is a different experience than the 2008 financial crisis. And I think that it is something that resonates more with people. But if we don't pay attention, we could also miss, right? That strategic foresight process allows us to have that foresight, but then there's an obligation to act. And what is that kind of foresight and acting obligation? Anyways, just had to get that, had to share those ideas with you. Let's move on to the next question. And this is about the session that I attended, which I just found to be so fascinating, which was around social cohesion. And, Louise, you've already talked about how those conversations led into one of the themes that you're exploring this year around power. But from coming out of that conversation and maybe subsequent conversations that you've had at Six and in other places, why is it important to focus on social cohesion? Why was that a topic that you all kind of paid attention to?
That's a great question, Liz. And actually we struggle, and I think you'll remember at the beginning, struggled a lot with the language of social cohesion, because it clearly means very different things to different people. But, we come at all of this not as an expert in philanthropy or in any of those topics, but as a convener and maybe an expert in people, or with some experience of thinking about people and getting some different kind of voices, as we said, diversity into the conversation, you know, we throw in a bomb like social cohesion and see where the conversation goes with that. But I think why is it particularly important right now? And it's a really interesting question for us, because, you know, I'm sure you all followed as the current crisis, you know, week on week, particularly in the UK, there's almost a different theme in the media of what we're reporting on relating to COVID-19. And I think something that's really, really strong at the moment is how the news stories and more stories have shifted into how the crisis disproportionately affects vulnerable communities. Like, this is the main thing, that actually the crisis has highlighted marginalization and the challenges of social cohesion. It's really highlighted the way we have based a lot of our conversation around blaming or othering people, of racism, of xenophobia. You know, now it's around elderly, that the crisis is in care homes, but actually, you know, there's a question that we have at Six at the moment, is where are all the voices of the young people in this? You know, young people from different, not just young people, but, you know, how the reports at the moment, how it's disproportionately affecting people from different ethnicities and ethnic backgrounds. So it's really interesting. And I think then if we play that back against, you know, what philanthropy is about the love of people, about promoting the wellness of others, you know, there's an interesting which is what a lot of the conversation on What's an Island was, but it's just so much heightened now, or at least you know, it's another way of putting these things out in the open, is, you know, where philanthropy can play a role, or what's the role of lots of different sectors in making sure that when we build back better, or however we want to talk about the future, that we build a future that's for everybody in society. And that means everybody in society needs to be responsible for building that future together. It can't just be built by the same traditional and established elite. So I think social cohesion is important now because it's being we're seeing how important it is now. It's really in our face every day. And the challenges around that are being much more recognized and talked about, and I think in a different way. And it's interesting to see how that will affect the behavior of lots of different types of organizations and sectors.
I have to unmute myself. Going forward, what do you see as the role of Six and really navigating through, let's say, the next 6 months, the next 12 months, and even the next 24 months? Because I think with the pandemic, you know, if we need to have multiple horizons, right? We need to have our response horizon, our recovery horizon, and, you know, increasingly the resilience horizon, right? The different way of being horizon. I don't know if there's an R word that suits that particularly. Resilience is as close as I've come. But what roles are you envisioning for these kind of next three horizons?
Sure. So there's, you know, organizationally is we've had to radically change a little bit what we're doing. But as I said, we were already trying to think about how we design our activities slightly differently and more openly, making sure that the walls are more porous in a way, because we were talking about power. So we knew that we needed to do something differently, and because people were moving to being more aware of their carbon footprints, that people wouldn't be traveling so much. So we were already thinking about how do we almost democratize lots of our conversations and make them more open, and that's just been accelerated. The question I think that's guiding us is, who is involved in envisioning this new future? How do we make sure that we make the new future is not just created by the old people again, but the new future is really created by everybody who's in it. We haven't rushed to join the media fury of you know, the thousands of people that are having the same kind of similar conversations around our new social contract, or, you know, building back better, or whatever all these words are. You know, in the first few weeks there's just this flurry of activities, and I couldn't even begin to think about how to read everything that everyone had commented on. So we decided not to join that, and actually to be a little bit you know, we're trying to be very considered, go deeper, beyond the rhetoric. Every time people throw out these words, we want to know really what they mean. So that's really driving us a lot at the moment. We're kind of excited about how we do virtual but still be human. You know, you guys are very practiced at your webinars, and you've been doing them for years, and it does feel like a very natural conversation. But lots of the people that have been doing lots of things online, it feels very unnatural. You know, staring to someone, you know, staring to lots of people's eyes for a good few hours is quite uncomfortable sometimes. So we're really interested in how, almost a word that's driving a lot of the work, the thinking that we're doing, is around deconstruction. So we look at every moment of the design of one of our events, of our retreats, to, you know, usually we're like, what does the room look like, and who is in it, and how are they interacting with each other? We're really going on body language. We're taking people on a pair walk around the island. We are doing things in different spaces. We're using nature in different ways. So when we're restricted and we can't be doing that in the same space, you know, how do we create the same kind of valuable and strong and deep and trusted relationships when we're not physically in the same place as each other? So we're kind of playing around with that, and we quite like an old low-tech solution like the good old telephone. Sometimes we're encouraging people to speak on the phone and not just stare at their screens. You know, if people can stand outside their front doors, or if they have a balcony or some outside space, stand out in the fresh air and have one of your calls. If it's possible, in different places, go for walks. So, you know, we're really trying to play with that, designing the questions and the icebreakers that we have on our calls in particular ways, so that, you know, we bring everyone into the same space. We're not all looking at which kind of clever books people have got on their bookshelves behind them. You know, all of these things, we're really looking at all those things, and we kind of want people to feel at ease online in the same way that we make people feel at ease in person, rather than just kind of feeling like, you know, screen junkies and robots. So that's some of the things that we need to think about for the next 6 to 12 to 24 months, because this will affect our work for a very long time, and probably beyond that. But we're not rushing into things. We have the privilege and luxury of not being at the front line on this, and we're letting the people who need to provide that frontline response do that really, really well. And we're really focusing on that kind of future horizon. And all of our work is about, you know, what's the future of social innovation the next 10 years, and the way that we design our society differently. So we also want to make sure, I would just finally say, that we're really connecting to other organisations who are having these kind of conversations. And to borrow a word from the Global Fund for Community Foundations in South Africa, we're interested in how we weave these conversations together. So we certainly don't want to repeat things that other people are doing, but where things can be woven together and connected in, I think that's really important for us. So we don't all have to be talking about the same thing at the same time.
Sophie, anything you want to add in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of build on that a little bit with some of the kind of key questions that we're thinking about at the moment, and this seemed like a really good opportunity to invite kind of more discussion on them, around them online, you know, on Twitter, or by getting in touch with us on email. And so, as we've been saying, we do a lot of physical convening and retreats and other things, and in this kind of new sort of online space, I think one of the things that's tricky for an organization like Six is, because we try and you know, the way that we convene is so important, how do we kind of maintain those values in online ways? So we're really interested in how organizations around the world are doing that, but also kind of acknowledging that this kind of new way of working, you know, for now, but also into the future, requires access to the internet and, you know, speaking English and those kind of things. And how do we ensure that actually, you know, we found ourselves in this situation, but it could be used in a really positive way to democratize knowledge and experiences in a you know, in a real kind of tangible way. And so, yeah, that again, we're really interested in how others are doing that. So would, yeah, invite anyone to get in touch if they want to talk about that.
Yeah, and I would say it would be great if other people have suggestions for some of the points that Sophie and Louise raised, to put them into the chat box, and we'd be happy to share them back with Six and let them know. I know I was just on a Zoom call last week with the Government of Canada, and in real time on the Zoom call, you could listen to the presentations in both French and English. You just had to press a button, and they had a translation service going on in real time, which was really quite exciting, because it then made it much more accessible to everyone who, it didn't matter what language they spoke, whether they spoke French or English. Now, that was only 2 language options, and I would imagine that in a global context, you'd probably need more language options, but I think that those are things that we have to kind of think about as we're convening folks in different kinds of ways. So thanks, Sophie and Louise, for this. I think what we'll do now is we're going to move into the question and answer portion of our call. I know I've been checking out the chat box and the question box, and I know we have some questions, but what I'll do is I'm going to throw it over to Duncan to perhaps pose some of the questions to us and see where we land. I know I've been watching the chat go forward and have seen some of you who are listening to this call putting in your thoughts and ideas, and we welcome you now to also put your questions into the question box as well. So Duncan, do we have any questions?
Yeah, thanks Liz for that. And yeah, we absolutely have a few questions to get through. And as Liz mentions, if you haven't already, you can open up the Q&A panel on your Zoom client and submit your questions, and also click on the thumbs up button to vote for which questions you'd like us to answer. The first is from Pamela. And Pamela asks if we could speak a bit more about power dynamics. So what are the greatest strengths and challenges of addressing power dynamics, and how does gender responsive work fit into this for you?
I can start and then...
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's really interesting. So I think one thing that kind of carries across Six's work is cultural translation, and we're really used to working with people from all over the world, and one of, I think, our key skills that we've built in doing this work for a while is being able to act as cultural translator in rooms of people from lots of different places. And it really helps that we have a small team, but a team that's really global. And we have kind of satellite team members in both Canada and Hong Kong. So I think one thing is like having that skill of cultural translation, and, you know, that not only applying to different global areas, but also within kind of conversations about power dynamics, and being able to notice and navigate the different power dynamics in a room. So I think that's something that's kind of always front of mind for us. In terms of kind of strengths and challenges of addressing power dynamics, one, you know, a couple of challenges maybe. Strengths is easier. It's something that's important. If you kind of acknowledge and really go into power dynamics, it can be the kind of source of some real change. In terms of challenges, I think often people are very ready to kind of talk about power in a very kind of abstract way and not kind of acknowledge their own place within it. We've also found that it can become very kind of very abstract, and people need tangible actions that they can locate themselves in. And one of the things that we're working on this year is thinking about shifting power in philanthropy and bringing together a bank of ways in which different foundations have successfully managed to kind of navigate that within their own organizations. And yeah, because I think often it can just be a kind of talking about it without actually making proper changes. The second thing I'd just say about the kind of gender responsive work, for us, we sort of sit at the social innovation level that's not kind of deep in any one issue, but gender comes really into it, especially when we're convening. And it's something that's really front of mind, both in terms of who's in the room, but who's talking, what are the different power dynamics at play, and how can we mitigate them, and how can we facilitate within that. I don't know if you want to add anything, Louise?
Perhaps only that, I think the awareness is really important. And actually we were putting together a advisory group for our year on power work, and we put together this list of incredible people. We looked at it and we were like, oh gosh, it's all women. Maybe we should invite a man to be in our year on power work, because otherwise we're going to have a really biased conversation. So, I know there's so much work, lots of people have policies that lots of people are having policies that make sure that you have gender mixed panels and those kind of things, and actually it just is never a problem for us. But I think Sophie is I would agree with everything that Sophie said, and maybe just build on or just emphasize the skill not only of cultural translation, but also I think any good facilitator is aware of power as number one, and develops a relationship with the people that you're hosting a conversation with that makes it appropriate and comfortable enough to be able to call out these things in a really non-threatening way. And I think that kind of part of the facilitator role is really key in hosting any of these conversations. So when we're having conversations about topics, we're making sure that we're practicing what we're preaching in a way. Not that we preach them, but we're practicing what we're talking about.
Great, thank you both. Our next question comes from Kit, and there was actually quite a bit of this in the chat as well, but they were wondering if you could speak to more about building capacity and change in boards. So what are the gaps, and what are key competencies to move forward within new paradigms?
Shall I start? Sophie, you can jump in. So I don't know what the figures are in Canada. I can't give you precise figures in the UK, but in fact the majority of charity boards are men, and white men of a particular age is just something that's come up a lot in the charity sector in recent months and over the last year. And people, there's a couple of organisations like Lankelly Chase, for example, in the UK, that actually have removed all the kind of major decision-making power from the board. So the board don't actually make decisions about grants anymore. And in another organisation that we took, again, to change that power dynamic, in another organisation that we've worked with in the UK, one of the board members said, actually, I don't think I'm the right person to be making these kind of calls about whether grantees should get their money. I really don't know the context in which they're working. I feel like I turn up to the meeting and all the applications look great, and but I feel bad if I say yes to everything, so I kind of choose one just to say no to. This is absolutely not how boards should work. So I think one of the things that's become really clear is that the boards are often not close enough to the work of the organisation, so shouldn't be making the decisions necessarily about where the funding is going. So many boards have quotas now, but many boards are just opening up, and they're just being much more aware of the kind of diversity and the makeup of the people who are on there, as well as thinking about the role of their boards in the first place. And this is a particular challenge with foundations where the board members are still where they're still alive. You know, there's another discussion that we see in foundations around how do you interpret the will of the person who gave the money in the first place as well. So there's a lot of things around interpretation, but I think the main change that we're seeing in boards is that they're changing the way that decision making is happening, and also bringing in people to the boards who are much more connected to the issues that the organisation is working on. Sophie, do you have any other comments on boards?
Yeah, I think that's yeah, would agree with all of that. I think there's a kind of 3 points to take into consideration. You know, who is on the board, but also why are they on the board, and the purpose they're serving, and whether they can really contribute to kind of helping advise and guide on the issues that philanthropic organisations are funding. And then also, as Louise was saying, the role of the board. And just to, yeah, kind of add in for 6, what I think one thing that we think is really important is that, you know, we are one of a number of organisations who are convening funders and having, you know, quite difficult, future-facing, really innovative conversations around philanthropy and the role of philanthropy. And I think for us, one thing that's quite clear is that there aren't enough board members, you know, either in those conversations or really interested in being in those conversations. And I think that's something that needs to be kind of examined. And for us, we are trying as hard as possible to bring more board members into our convening. And yeah, I think that's something that we're going to try and continue to focus on going forward.
Oh, thank you both for those responses. That's actually really insightful, and I think there's a lot of us on the call that appreciate that insight. Unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of our time together. And just before we wrap up, I just have a few quick announcements, and then we'll be on our way. I just wanted to let everyone know that throughout April and into May, and actually into June as well, the Tamarack Institute is committed to bringing you free weekly community building webinars to help equip you for community change as we all adjust to a new normal. So coming up, we have some webinars on how to host virtual communities of practice, poverty reduction, as well as community change in general. And if you can't join the live events, you can register and get a full recording of the discussion after the call. So I just wanted to take this opportunity, Sophie and Louise, to thank you both for joining us and sharing your wisdom with the Tamarack Network. We've really appreciated what you've had to say. It's been a pleasure having you.